all the way to the south. That's good. All right. Grab your seats. 30 seconds. Okay. All right.
don't know. Oh, I didn't see that.
Okay, everybody, come on, get through the food. So welcome, everybody. So glad to see so many people. The house full. It's fantastic. So today I'm very pleased to have Roddy Tucker. He's one of our postdoctoral fellows. And it's maybe the first talk you give after your interview. So it's sort of a bit of an introduction. You've been here a while, but an introduction to the community, what the work he's doing now. And so he came to us from Northeastern University in Boston with a PhD in criminology and social justice.
Justice
policy, which I like the title, but he told me that it's mostly criminology, and the background also in sociology. And here he's appointed with us, but also jointly with psychology and Professor Mark Furman and the Data Sciences Initiative. So you'll see that basically Riley's work really triangulates a lot of the emergent data that's available online and by news sources with, I think he really has a talent to also identify sort of classical ideas and studies, including kind of old Chicago school sort of ideas. So, and in doing that, he's gonna, I think, give us a sense of how network data, so relational data, can be assembled from these sources, particularly to study issues of criminology. So without much further ado, Riley, it's a pleasure. So you happy with questions as you go, right?
Of course.
Okay.
Chicago way. All right, thank you everyone for coming out today, and thank you, Luis, for the introduction. I'm really excited to kind of share some exploratory work that I've been doing with my colleagues at the Environmental Neuroscience Lab. Sure, my clicker isn't.
Probably need to press the slide.
Yeah, I'll change. Oh, okay. If I just click, I think I'll get. So I want to start off with like a little bit of a story here. So this past fall, I was like sitting in my apartment in Woodlawn, and my phone went off. And it was one of these kind of like crime tracking apps that I have, and it told me there was like an act of violence in my neighborhood this day. And within a couple of hours, I was able to get like the full story of what happened. So a gang-affiliated teenager went to like a rival territory to taunt his enemies. And he did this like Instagram live video. So he shows himself where he is to kind of say like, I'm in your neighborhood. And he's also showing off a gun to say like he's ready for an altercation. As this video is going, the comments are like flooding with people taking interest and also people saying like, get off live. You're making yourself unsafe, like you're showing everyone off your locations. Eventually, the Instagram live ended. Within a couple of hours, 911 calls came in, and a man was found deceased in Woodlawn from like a shooting incident. And so I was able to learn like this like really like in-depth information. It didn't come from a media source or like traditional news. All this information I got came from an online message board where people discuss activities involving Chicago gangs. So what I kind of want to explore today is, can these kinds of like online message boards and crowdsourced knowledge kind of like have utility for studying gangs more rigorously? And so to contextualize this, I want to just give a little bit of background on kind of like prior research on gangs that's occurred. And so research on Chicago gangs goes back like a really long time. So Thrasher was doing this as part of kind of like the classic Chicago School of Sociology in the 1920s. And very in line with this perspective, he was interested in how ecology of places kind of shapes behavior, right? So his perspective really was that like urban places are kind of a habitat that can kind of like give birth to gangs and gang activity. And what he did, like especially because this is back in the 20s, is like pretty impressive. He spent 7 years just like doing his best to identify every gang in Chicago, and he was taking like every kind of information that he could, like hanging out with community groups, just like find out who like the local gang was and that kind of thing. In like over 7 years, he was able to get information on over 1,300 of these gangs operate in Chicago. So like kind of like proto big data, as much of that kind of like early Chicago schoolwork was. However, today we don't really need to spend like 7 years of our time just to kind of gather data on gangs and how they operate. We have like many other pieces of information that criminologists, social scientists can capitalize on to learn about these processes. And from my read of the literature, like the vast majority of this data kind of starts with police, right? So kind of like on a basic level, you can imagine that police are kind of keeping internal records about gangs, right? Like as they kind of interact with people, arrest people, they're gathering intelligence, right? Like where does your gang operate? Like what gang are you affiliated with? Are there tattoos that are associated with your gang, right? Like police are just kind of working to understand gangs like through the information they can get. But what scientists have kind of tapped into is that as police are kind of like operating, they are generating like really rich data on gang networks. So for example, one of these common sources is like co-arrest data, right? You can look at like two people who get arrested together and you can say, okay, these people know each other. And then there's kind of like a similar thing with like field interrogation reports, right? So you have police officers who will kind of just like stop someone on the street and talk to them. That leads to a report. And you know, researchers kind of concluded like, oh, if FIO report is naming two individuals, that we can assume that those individuals know each other, right? They were at least like interacting in real space together at one time. And so as a result of this like really rich data that comes from police departments, gang networks is like a really hot area of study within kind of like criminology. And so kind of like the basic heuristic here is like using data that can kind of connect two people, create networks, right? Measure who knows who, and then evaluate how like an individual's position in that structure changes their outcome. Could be whether, you know, they're a victim of crime or offending, right? Just kind of understanding how someone's position in this larger structure impacts kind of like their personal outcomes. And so the big thing that is like shaking up how gangs are thought about and researched is the internet. So gang activity increasingly takes place on the digital streets, right? So before the internet, if two people in opposing gangs were going to have an interaction, it basically meant that they were kind of like running into each other on the street in some kind of like real life interaction. With like online, for like two people to have beef, it's just a matter of one person sending a message to another, right? And like the geographical proximity is no longer as relevant, right? So it's kind of like a tool for people to interact. And so law enforcement has kind of like long recognized that gang activity is going out, like playing out online, and they're interested in it, right? So as of 2014, 81% of law enforcement agencies in this country were monitoring social media, right? That was like 2014. That's like before anyone had even thought of TikTok. I don't really know that, but I'm guessing, right? Like social media has kind of like grown a lot, and I can almost guarantee that a much higher rate of law enforcement agencies are like using this data than they were in 2014. Additionally, academics have like gotten really interested in thinking about how like gang interactions play out online. And a lot of times it's like you kind of like pick a platform and look what's going on there, right? So like Twitter is like a really common source. You can see at the right here is a bunch of tweets from individuals who are like reacting to an incidence of gang violence in Chicago. Facebook is another one that's been used a lot. And the one that's really interesting to me that's kind of like now emerging in literature is the role of YouTube. So Forrest Stewart did an ethnography of some Southside gangs right in this area, and he found that 69% of these gangs are utilizing YouTube. And kind of like the normal way that YouTube is used is they post rap videos, right? So it's like rap songs where they'll kind of like talk about gang violence and kind of like talk about the gangs that they're beefing with and show off their weapons, like this kind of thing, really like asserting like the gang activity through the rap music. And so we're actually gonna come back to the rap music before this talk ends.
Are there limits in that kind of language or threats that are made in these videos from YouTube?
Limits in terms of
YouTube-
what?
From YouTube managing the content.
No, not that I know. I've
So
never
I-
heard of any of the stuff getting. They'll do kind of funny stuff, right? Like it's like you put like a text before the video that's like all of the guns are props. Like those kind of things. I mean, because like I don't know, like guns and stuff are in movies all the time. So I think it'd be hard for YouTube to enforce that. But no, as I have not heard of anyone having trouble with like publishing this stuff through YouTube. And so when you have all this stuff getting posted online, right? You have police taking notice, you have academics taking notice, but you also have just like members of the public, right? And so there's like all of these online spaces where non-gang affiliated people are also kind of like discussing gangs, right? So this is just kind of like a screenshot on the right of like a random blogger who I found who just like blogs about different gangs. And like there's this whole infrastructure of information online to teach people about the gang activity, right? So like blogs, the YouTube videos, the rap lyrics. And so here on the right, you have DJ Academics, who's like probably one of like the biggest media people in hip hop. Like he has a Spotify podcast. However, he got his start as a college student at Rutgers doing this War in Chirac video series, right? Where he's like reporting on the Chicago gangs from New Jersey, right? And this all creates like a whole bunch of information that people can learn from to think about gangs on their own. And then when gang fans, I really do think that they're fans, when they kind of like learn all of this information, then they then discuss it in their own spaces in highly detailed ways, right? So today I'm going to be talking about an online space where people frequently claim to know like the culprits of unsolved murder, right? That's like a common thing. Like there's like dozens and dozens of murders they claim to have solved, just kind of like from what's going on social media and everything. There's a big problem here, which is according to Forrest Stewart's ethnography, the gang activity posted online is highly sensationalized, right? So there's like really this kind of incentive where if you do a video talking about violence, showing off guns, there's a belief that like more people will kind of like tap in and want to watch that. So if someone wants to be a micro celebrity, as Forrest Stewart puts it from this context, there's like a lot of incentive to kind of tout violence and kind of that kind of stuff. And like, it's like really sensationalized. So like he has a story from his ethnography where like one of these youth who was like frequently touting guns in videos, like tried to load a gun and like could not do it, right? Just like basic like lack of literacy in gun stuff. But then this is someone who's online, like, you know, talking all the time about, you know, shooting at people and having weapons, that kind of thing, right? So like the stuff that the gang fans are learning from is like not necessarily rooted in reality. And so I think this creates kind of an interesting scenario, right? Because you have young men who are incentivized to lie about kind of how violent they are and really kind of like play up that stuff. And then you have people online who are kind of consuming this material and learning from it, right? They're basically treating it as reality, presumably. And then you have these online spaces, right, where we've essentially like filtered out the original content and we're just getting people talking about it, right? So even though this is surely a noisy source of information, I was really interested to see, like, is there any kind of like nuggets of truth that travel from those original social media posts into the crowdsourced database? And so that's really what I want to explore here today. And so getting into the specific data that I'm going to look at. So for this, I'm focusing on a forum that was started to discuss Chicago drill rap. And so it started in 2017 and barely anyone was using it at that time. But by today, this forum has over 200,000 followers. So you can like roughly think about that as like when a post gets made, someone gets like a notification that like they should like check their feed because there's a new post on here. And so you might be wondering what's drill rap. So drill rap is a subgenre of rap that started right here in Chicago. And there's academic literature arguing that like the musical practices of drill rap are deeply intertwined with gang culture, right? So it's a lot of talking about gang beefs, the people who are in gangs, kind of like incidents that go on between them, right? It's like really like the gang activity is the focus in both the videos and the songs. And so on the right here, we have Chief Keef's Finally Rich, you may be familiar. This is really what academics kind of point to as being like when drill rap kind of came into mainstream. And what I want to kind of like impart on you is that this is not like a niche musical movement, right? So it's like blown up. There's like a really popular British drill subgenre. And then kind of like within the last year or so, some of you all may recognize Cardi B. She's like one of the biggest rappers out there. So she hopped on a New York drill rap song. And so in the back there is like a mural of a young man who died. And in the song, they kind of like make light of another young man who have died, like essentially laughing about the fact that he died. And you'll notice they're wearing a lot of red. The color choice is not exactly a coincidence, right? This is like heavily kind of like laden with gang messaging, and this is like one of like the biggest kind of people in music right now, right? So like this drill movement is like really big, which is what allows kind of the fans to pay attention, right? And so the activity on this forum is pretty mixed, right? So I would say like one of the most common things is like pictures of gang affiliated people, just kind of saying like, here's a picture of these people that we're paying attention to. There's also a lot of discussion, right? So just text posts where people are talking about people involved, their relationships to each other, activities, et cetera, et cetera. Then, of course, right, at the end of the day, it is a Chicago drill rap forum. People do share the music videos quite a lot and discuss them. And then finally, right, they're just like kind of a big mixture of random stuff that people talk about. This really is a community where people are kind of like friends and know each other, and they might just complain about like getting broken up with or whatever, kind of like, it's just like a broad social media space at times. And so our starting point to analyze this was about 250,000 post titles. So just like the title of posts from 2018 to 2022. And so we set out to learn just like a couple of pieces of information. These are like pretty low hanging fruit, but we thought that if we could kind of like extract this information from the forum, that it would be like an interesting project to pursue. Right, and so one of the things we wanted to learn: who are the gang affiliated individuals that are followed by the message board? Which gangs are they affiliated with? And then where is each gang located? And now for those first two questions, we were really able to benefit because the posters of this message board use like a really kind of like common post style to describe these things, right? So this is like a text that I wrote based off a gang member from Gang Leader for a Day. And so the basic thing is that when they're writing these post titles, they'll like name someone that's affiliated with a gang, and then they'll use either brackets or parentheses to actually like identify what gang that person is affiliated with. So they actually like couldn't have made it any easier for us to extract this information. Like we've joked, it's like they're like purposefully building a database for people to research because it's just like so obvious. And so we're gonna have like this two-part strategy to like using NLP to get out the information we wanted. So to extract aliases, which would be T-bone here, we used a parts of speech identifier to identify proper nouns, right? So this is basically you can like take a sentence, and because of the structure of the sentence, it's able to identify when a proper noun is referenced, even if the proper noun is like not something that like we would normally recognize as a name, right? A lot of these gang aliases are like really messy, right? They have like numbers and kind of other stuff in them. This algorithm we found performed well to like pull out what we wanted it to get. And then for extracting the affiliations, we simply just look at the text that are in brackets and parentheses, right? Just kind of like scooping out the Black Kings from the statement. So we get the alias and affiliations just from a kind of like simple word search of post titles. And so we had to actually think about how do we like kind of conclude that someone is affiliated with a certain group. And so we kind of decided as a baseline, if someone is mentioned less than 5 times, we probably don't have enough information to conclude anything about them. I thought there might be a protest going on during my talk.
Not about your talk, though. I don't think.
No, I don't think
Might be
anyone's
T-bone.
protesting my talk yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. I mean, maybe by the time I'm done here. Right, and so we subset to only individuals that have more than 5+ posts. And so here is like an example, kind of like imagine that T-bone was mentioned 6 times during our period of analysis. And so something we found quickly is that we need to allow wiggle room for crowd mistakes, right? The crowd does not always get it right. And we actually found that some of like the lower percentage matches were among these like really, really famous rappers who are like getting talked about a lot. You can like go on Wikipedia and see who they're affiliated with. But because like the crowd has like some noise in the knowledge, if we use a strict like 100% match or 95% match, we would have been like missing out a lot of good information, right? So like here's the example where like T-Bone is labeled Black Kings 5 times, but then there's like the 6th time where someone labels him as like a corner boy, right? So we need to kind of get around that. And so what we settled on is that individuals who are posted with a given affiliation in 70% or more posts are assumed to be affiliated with that group. So we wanted like more than half, but we needed to like not go all the way to 95. And this just kind of seemed to be like a happy medium. You have a question?
Yeah, I was gonna ask about movement across gangs over time, and also like just, I don't know, like if individuals move, and then also if like gangs rename themselves.
Yeah, so we like moved over that. Like that's something I wanted to dig into further is like when people are co-affiliated. But yeah, it's just like a messy thing. So like using like 70%, like if someone was like truly affiliated with 2 groups, you would expect them to have like 50% match on both, so they would get screened out.
Like if you go back to the data structure that you just showed on the previous slide, like do you have years also associated with those posts?
Yeah, so we're treating it all cross-sectionally right now.
Okay.
Which is like something I'll get into at the end. And yeah, it seems like it is a thing where like the sets kind of like rename themselves. And so like, I mean, you'll see like with the network, it's like possible that some of our sets that we're treating as different actually like would consider themselves to be like generations, but like we're not quite that far yet.
Sorry, a follow-up on that. Regarding sort of the uniqueness of each character, are you able to uniquely identify them? Because like some of these names are quite generic, so should I be worried that there's a T-Bone in like 2 or 3 gangs, and then you have a 30-30-30 split, and according to your heuristic, you might think like let them drop out or something?
Yeah, no, definitely. And like that is like a thing that we actually, it is more of a problem than I expected. So in a little bit, I'll show where we kind of like merged this data to like an external data set that would kind of like demonstrate that. And so like the final analysis like removes anyone that had like multiple, like 2 people with the same name in this alternative data set, unless if this alternative data set labeled a person with a set and we had a person from that set, we assume it'll be right. But there is kind of like potential for bias in that part of the process.
Quick follow-up, like going back to the question of movement, do you have a timestamp for each of these? Because if you have timestamps and you observe the T-Bone like in 3 different occasions, like time-wise, you might think of a movement to another gang.
So we have time of post, but I would not conclude that like the time of post reflects time of relationships. Because I'll get into this like a little bit more, but like some of these posts are like literally like people when they were babies. So it's like we can't just like say like, okay, if there's a post about these 2 guys today, that means that they're friends today. In effect, like a lot of the people that they write about are like no longer living. So it's a little complicated. Any other questions? Right, okay, so we used a 70% match and we landed with a sample of 421 individuals affiliated with 65 gangs. And now, while like 65 gangs, like at first we're like, hooray, like we got huge coverage. When we like dug in the data, it turned out that many of our gangs only had 1 or 2 affiliates. And I want to like kind of mention there is like a literature on 2 people gangs. Like this is a thing that exists out in the world, but we didn't really think that's what we're capturing, right? If it's like an online forum, they're probably not getting like the tiny guys, right? They're like more likely to be getting like the most prominent gangs. So it seemed like kind of hard to assume that there would be like gangs of 2. And so we took this as a weak signal issue, right? Like the crowd is only getting information about some aspects of Chicago gang activity. And so we needed to figure out what to keep. And we ended up settling on what I would consider to be a conservative strategy. And so we only keep what we consider to be large gangs, those with 10 or more people. And then we only wanted to keep ones that are known to Chicago Police Department, because we assume if Chicago Police is tracking a gang, and if like we have a lot of them in our data set, then it's like probably we're getting like a decent enough signal to start learning about. And so it turned out that like almost all of our large gangs were in fact kind of like measured by Chicago Police Department. So 10 out of 12 gangs with 10 more affiliates were mentioned in the Chicago Police Department data. Gang arrests, I'll go into this a little bit more, but it's basically just like a bunch of individuals, what set they're affiliated with, and where they kind of had their first arrest, right? And so from using the sets and that data, we were able to figure out which gangs CPD pays attention to. And so one kind of like preliminary takeaway from this is that the forum is non-representative, right? It is focused on a specific gang conflict. After kind of like whittling away the more biased kind of like nodes, we landed with 247 affiliates from 10 gang sets. Lydia.
So this tells us about how many people in the forum are in the Chicago database, but can you talk about the other way? Like what % of the Chicago database gangs are in the forum?
So that would be, so there's no way to directly check individuals because there's no individual
Okay.
names. So we're just looking at sets. And yeah, like the CPD data does have like a lot of sets in it. Like I think there's like over 1,000 sets in Chicago, right? So it's like a really, really small sample. However, what I'm going to try to impart on you all is that we have like really rich information about kind of like one gang conflict. I think there's like still interesting stuff that we can learn from this data infrastructure. Over time, I'm sure that the approach could be improved to kind of like bring in more folks. And so the last kind of piece of this, right, we have like the people and like who we think they're affiliated with. The last part is like the network type, right? So most network data is based on two individuals directly interacting, right? That's like true with like the police data sets. And in fact, I think that's true with like most social network data. It's about like people having real interactions. Here, we define a tie as existing when two individuals are named in a post, right? So someone in the crowd just mentions two people together in a post, and we assume that that's a tie. And it's like kind of a tricky thing to wrap your head around because this data represents like really abstract connections between individuals that like the online community signs, right? So, and like for sure, like all of these are examples of like real things that happen in the data, right? You have people talking about like, oh, these two guys are friends with each other. You have, oh, these two guys are rivals with each other. Then you kind of have these conversations about like rappers that like may or may not actually have anything to do with gang conflict, and it could all be like who had the best song this year type of thing. And then finally, kind of like to your point about like temporal features, is that like the posts that people are sharing could be from like anywhere in time, right? So like one of these common postings is they'll like share pictures of like a bunch of people they pay attention to when they were babies, right? Like gang affiliated people as babies. And so it makes it kind of like really tricky to think about like temporally, what do these ties mean? But I really wanted to dig into like, could these connections still be informative, right? Is there any kind of like good nugget of truth that like travels from like the original posters into the crowdsourced data? And so here is the gang network that we put together from this data. Each color on that is a distinct set. And for visualization purposes, we weighted the network so nodes are closer together when they are mentioned more frequently. So this is kind of like the underlying data that we're working with for these.
So these are individuals and the colors are gangs? You call them sets. but
Set, yeah, and I'll get, yeah, there's a couple of hierarchies of gang organization that we're gonna get into. And so if you remember, I said we wanted to know the person from the gangs, their affiliation, and kind of like where they operate. So for the geographic part, we were also able to use crowdsourced information. So on the message board, someone created a Google map, right? It's like a Google map where you can just like create your own polygons. And they labeled over 1,000 of these gang turfs throughout Chicago. And because they labeled the set of each turf, we were able to do just like a basic join on set name. And here, each of these red polygons is a set in our network. And you can see, like I said before, right, we're getting like a really small subsample of gang activity because we're essentially, as I'm arguing, I think we're basically getting this one conflict that is going on in like the Washington Park area. And that's actually like something that comes up is like the Washington Park is like kind of an informal geography that people talk about as being associated with. And now reasonably, someone could say like some random person posted this online, like why on earth should we believe a random person? And so I wanted to validate that. And so for that, I can use the Chicago Police Department data, right? So as I mentioned before, it names a bunch of sets, and then it names kind of like the police beat where someone was first arrested. So this is like an example of one set in our network. And what I've done is mapped out where people that CPD police are in that set had their first arrest, right? And so the darker polygons are the ones where like more people from that set got arrested for the first time. So like if my kind of crowdsourced polygon for this set is accurate, then we would expect like right around this area would be kind of like where that set is located. And so I'm gonna put a red polygon up from the crowdsourced data. It's like spot on. And in fact, I did this exercise for like all of the sets, and like the consistency is really good. The only problem that you get is that in some of the sets, CPD only has like 4 or 5 arrests. So it's like you don't get like these like deep orange patterns. You just kind of get like a couple of polygons that have like 1 or 2 arrests. However, like the crowdsourced polygon is always like right in that area where those arrests are, even for the sets that are kind of like not getting arrested as much by Chicago police. So, I mean, we thought this was a really good validity check for the crowdsourced data and ran with it.
So quick clarification, I was a little, I did not quite follow how you went from your initial map of crowdsourced data and it showed north side of Washington Park and south side, but then the second representation, you just had a single point on the south side of Washington Park. What was the difference?
Sorry, I'm over here. Here?
Yeah, well, that was the police data, but you had before that, yeah. So here you only have one small polygon, but then earlier on you had.
Right, so this red polygon is just one set, and the map underneath it is like only people from that set got arrested. So it's like, it's comparing within sets. Does that make sense?
Okay,
So like, and then like these here are examples from some of the other, and like each of these red polygons is like on that first map that we were looking at.
mhm.
In the back.
One question and one maybe like French. So the question is, why first arrest and not like most common? So
That's
thinking
what's
about
released.
Set and like if you're and even thought about like type of arrest, right? Like I'm just thinking there's lots of things that can be found based on folks' arrest activity, what they're getting arrested for. It's gonna potentially mess with like what they're being tagged as. It's also dependent on CPD's knowledge. So CPD tags folks based on who they're with, not necessarily like actual knowledge.
Well, so I think that CPD likely tags people on like where they live. Cause like there's like these really wonky things in the data where you have like 73-year-olds who are like, they list them as being affiliated with a gang. Like their first arrest was like at 73 and then they list them as a gang. I assume in those cases, like they arrested someone from a gang territory and then they just like labeled them as an affiliate.
So they do both things. They arrest based on who you get arrested with, and then also like where they are at. So I'm just curious, like again, if there's any particular reason it was like first and not most common.
Yeah, it would be interesting. It's like that's something we need to get through a FOIA. And like we've talked about that. And actually the crowd will do this thing where they'll like FOIA like every mugshot for a certain person. And like those will like include the like arrest locations of each arrest. So like for like a really small number of individuals, we could probably dig into that. But just like not where the data is yet. Like this actually got FOIA'd, like the data I'm working with, someone else FOIA'd. And so I think they like gave out like the minimum they could.
Then the other thing is, so we've done a pretty deep dive in the far south side in terms of the accuracy of the CPD, like tagging of folks, the gang cards, and at the gang level, so like GD, BD, like that larger gang level, they're right about 50% of the time. At the set level, in the screening that we looked at in the far south side, they're right about 7% of the time, based on like other sort of like general knowledge of other gang affiliated people.
Yeah, and so I'm hoping with this data, like these gangs are like really famous. Like I haven't kind of talked about it, but like these are like the gangs where like the famous Chicago rappers come from. So I'm hoping that like there's like a better signal like the police are getting, because like these are kind of like the more renowned gangs in the city. But indeed, right, I have seen this kind of thing that like the CPD's tagging is kind of like inefficient, which would like one of the interesting questions here is like, could we use the social media data instead, I think. And like I'm not sure that I have like a conclusive answer to that, but it's like kind of like where this could head. All right, so here is where we kind of validated gang polygons. And so there is kind of like one important or like useful piece of information that comes from CPD data. So as I kind of mentioned, or just like refreshing you, so we got names of individuals through natural language processing. We got their set through natural language processing. So those are like the polygons that we were looking at. But CPD also, and apparently with 50% accuracy, labels sets as a nation, right? And so like here for the nations, I put like blood Crips, and like neither the Bloods or the Crips actually operate in Chicago as far as I'm aware. But this is to kind of demonstrate that these are like these like really big like picture gangs that like you may have like heard about, right? They have like chapters in different cities and stuff. And my understanding of this history is essentially that like in the 90s and like the 2000s, like those nations were really kind of like the gang infrastructure of Chicago. But over time, kind of like as those groups got destabilized, like the large nations broke into smaller sets. The sets still, it seems like, loosely identify with the nations, like that comes up in the music a lot. So there's like some kind of like hierarchical structure going on here, though I think it's a little bit ambiguous how nation and set kind of work together. But that was kind of, I just wanted to build the infrastructure to kind of think about it a little bit. And so, right, because we know like the nation that each set is associated with, we can put a color on it, right? So each of these colors are now the nation that CPD believes each set to be associated with. And it's interesting, right? Because you have like a cluster of purple here, then you have kind of like a cluster of the blue right next to it, right? You can imagine that that is kind of a catalyst for conflict right there. And so also we can look at the nations in terms of network. So this is the same exact thing we were looking at before with the sets, but we've just colored kind of the nodes based on the nation rather than the set. And you can see like the purples and the greens are pretty pervasive and all close to each other, which means that they've been co-mentioned a lot in the message board. So what can we actually learn from this data? Is it actually good, right? Is this just kind of like pointless information coming from the crowd? And so the first thing I wanted to dig into is the kind of like findings of this data consistent what people have shown with police networks? And so there's this kind of like body of literature that I'm interested in that shows that like gun violence is contagious, essentially, right? Like the more of your friends who get shot, the more likely you are to have this kind of outcome, and kind of like the network distance, right? So like if your friend has a friend that has gotten shot, that also kind of like increases your likelihood. And so this has been done a bunch by like Andrew Papachristos and colleagues. There's like a lot of papers kind of similar on this. For this one, we kind of like based our comparison off the specific study from 2012. And the reason we thought it was a good comparison is because they really focus in on this one neighborhood of Dorchester in Boston, right? So like they're looking at a network of one neighborhood. We thought that was like a good comparison for our network of one neighborhood, right? Like basically you just wanted to look into like can kind of like the distance from a node to nodes that have died, does that kind of impact one's likelihood of mortality? And so we have two mortality networks that we're thinking about here, right? So on the left, this is Papachristos network from Boston, and on the right is a network for Chicago. And mortality information also came from the crowdsourced message board. So like they actually keep like a table on there where it's like each row is a person. It has both their government name, their alias, date of death, and then like a news story about it. So like really, really rigorous, right? I mean, like that's like ready to be downloaded as a CSV, essentially. And like one thing that and so on this plot on the right here, the green nodes are nodes of people who we believe to be alive, and the red nodes are people that we identified as having died. And like one thing that you'll notice is that our network is like A, much smaller, we have less people, but B, it's also a lot more dense with kind of people who have died, right? And that's just like, there's major crime differences between Chicago and Boston. Boston has like 34 homicides in the average year. We're at like 600, 700, right? So it's kind of like a different reality. I just kind of wanted to like put that up front, that like we wouldn't necessarily expect our findings to like match perfectly because it is kind of two different geographic contexts. So I wanted to see if our data can kind of show similar things Papachristos. And first I wanted to actually like dig into that hierarchical process a little bit, because I haven't seen this done within the network stuff. And so for this, I just use like a 3-level HLM where I nested nodes within their sets and their nations. And just like running an empty model, you can look at like kind of like where the variance hangs out. And so about 4% of like variance and mortality exists at both sets and nation levels. So what that kind of suggests is that without controlling for anything, being affiliated with certain sets or nations would be expected to be more risky than others. So I kind of want to think about like, oh, what could make affiliation with some groups more risky than others. So then we kind of add in some controls and a couple things kind of jump out in relation to the Papachristos work. So the first thing is that the more central someone is in the structure, right? So basically the more people they're co-mentioned with, the higher the risk of mortality is. And like interestingly, in the Papa Cristo study, they put in this variable and it didn't reach significance. So that was kind of like one interesting difference. But then we get this percentage of dead altered, right? So this is the percentage of people that I'm directly tied to who have died. And that has like a really strong effect there. So it's like for every one standard deviation in the percentage of your close friends who have passed away, the likelihood of you dying increases by 5 times, right? So like really massive effect. And so Papa Christos and them also got this finding, but their effect size was about half. And the last thing I'll kind of flag is that our log likelihood was like a great bit stronger than kind of what the Papa Christos article had. So like these are pretty good results, we thought, even if they don't match perfectly onto what Papa Christos did. One thing that I thought was really interesting is that, right, I said like before controlling for anything, the variation across sets and nations was like 4% each. After controlling for the network features, that variance goes to 0, right? So if sets or gangs are kind of like more associated with death, it's because of like the network structure underlying them. Like I was kind of interested in like geographic stuff. Like there's one set that people always kind of like say is like, oh, they got gates, so no one can get them. So I was wondering, like, is there like a routine activity explanation that could kind of help explain further variance and kind of who dies? But like this says like, no, we don't really need to look the play stuff at all. It's like all about kind of like this network that we have here.
Well, it gives it a little bit. So you say you're talking about 3 to 4% of the variation explained by the hierarchical process. That seems low. Maybe is it low?
No, not
How should I
really.
think about that?
I mean, like there's like a million like neighborhood sociology articles where they're looking at like 5% variation neighborhood level. So yeah, I mean, like it's, you definitely wouldn't say that this is like a set or nations phenomenon, but like you might think that there's like variables at those levels that could help explain variation.
You have a question from Andrew. Let's see what it is. Interesting. What's the causality for that alters?
Yeah, so I think Andrew, I can't see your whole question, but I think it's like, what is the Sure, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, it's what is the causality for dead alters? Do close contacts all die at the same time? And what do you think the time course of mortality is for the networks?
Yeah, I mean, the time course is like completely like something that we can't measure. I mean, I really see this as like being like part of a beef, right? There's like kind of like this big thing in literature of retribution, right? So like the idea would be if you're affiliated with a set and like someone kind of like attacks your friend in the set, there's an expectation that you'll actually like attack them back, right? So I think it's like a back and forth process, right? Like your friend dies, your set attacks the other set, someone's coming back for you. So I really see this as kind of like an ongoing conflict. And as far as how long that takes, it's like completely mixed, right? Like you hear stories where someone dies and then like someone from the rival set gets killed the same day. Sometimes these things like take place over a year. So I think like definitely like the temporal questions are really what we need to dig into with the next steps of this project. But like what we have right now is like very just cross-sectional in nature.
You had one more question. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is there timestamp information in the data?
Yeah, there are timestamp information in the data, but we don't, the timestamps like do not bear on real life connections at all. Someone could make a post today that was like a picture of people who were like hanging out 10 years ago. Or it could be people who like their moms were friends, so they were pictured together as babies, but they may not have talked to each other for 10 years. So yeah, we don't really know kind of like the time span of these network ties at all.
So you have about 10 minutes. So you
Okay.
could take the questions to the end, or you could answer them now. It's up to you.
Maybe I want to get to that. I want to talk about the rap lyrics. Okay. And so in addition to kind of comparing our data to the police network, I also wanted to see like, does this kind of like crowdsourced data compare to data that people have like measured interactions between gang members online, right? And so specifically what caught my eye is that this past study that they studied like a Facebook group of Chicago Hispanic gangs. Like that was kind of like the focus of it. And they showed that like 2 people were like more likely to diss each other when their sets were closer together, right? So there's like this really basic expectation that when you have 2 geographies that are closer to each other, there tends to be more interactions. And so we tried that in our data, and it turns out that this finding replicates pretty well. So on the left here, we have our co-mentions network. So each of these nodes is now a set rather than a person. And then on the right is just like the geographic network, just kind of like distance from centroids. And so what we found is that affiliates of two different sets were more likely to be co-mentioned when their set turfs were closer together, right? So like a pretty basic kind of like association there, but it's like one that we would expect to find if this data is kind of capturing real world networks. And the strength of our correlation was actually like fairly similar to that from like the Facebook study. Like theirs was at 0.4 and ours was at 0.3. Like I thought that was a big win, right? If like this crowdsourced data is capturing the connections between sets almost as well as like actual interactions between the gang members, it seems to me that we're like, you know, capturing pretty good information about the conflict. And so, right, basically everything that I have shown here is validation, right? Like this is just kind of like a big project to kind of like dig into, like, is this data even valuable? And I mean, we can talk about it after, but I think that there's kind of like more to be done with this data. There's like stuff that we can learn. So I want to talk a little bit about where I'm thinking this headed. And so this gets to the temporal piece that everyone's asking about, right? And so what we're looking at right here is a plot where like the x-axis is months and the y-axis is how frequently someone is getting mentioned on the message board. And so this is actually the plot of mentions from like the young man whose like story I talked about at the beginning of this talk, right? And so we can see in like the months preceding his death, there's a huge spike. And so what we're kind of interested in thinking about is the crowd kind of like monitoring behavior that can put someone at risk. Is that what they're talking about, right? If someone is like, they're dissing a lot online, showing guns off online, that's like something that could get the crowd talking, but like we're also curious, like could that put someone at risk? And we see like several examples where there's like these huge spikes around the time that someone dies as far as the post frequency. So we're like really interested to start looking at it longitudinally, like from that perspective, is like the crowd's kind of attention to someone, like demonstrative of someone kind of like getting in a risky situation. We're also super interested in the role of rap music. So like, as I said at the beginning, commonly in these songs, they'll kind of like name specific people. And I realized kind of like fairly early in this project that a lot of like the names in our network are also mentioned directly in the rap songs. So what we're looking at now is a network visual of a diss track. And so in yellow, we have two rappers on the song. And then all of like the dots that are highlighted are people that were mentioned in the song. So this is like a song where they were naming a lot of people. This is like really where you see kind of like that back and forth with the gangs, right? So like this person, these people in green did a diss track. And then here is a response track, right? And like they use like the same instrumental. And now we can see that like the rapper is like from the blue group rather than the green. And sorry, it's like really like we think there's a lot here as far as thinking about kind of like network connections through the music, but it's complicated. So this is like a subset from that first track. And you'll notice that like everyone here is in green. And so what happened on this track is the two rappers were like kind of naming some of their friends, basically say, or like, you know, affiliated gang members. And they're saying like, hey, like keep their name out of your mouth, like don't you dare mess with them. Lo and behold, someone responded to that track on the same beat again, specifically saying like, you know, like making fun of those people's deaths, right? So there really is like a conversation going on through these rap lyrics that also kind of like connects to like what's going on in the network. And so this stuff also gets to the complicated hierarchies. So here's a track where someone starts off saying like, I'm going to kill everyone from that nation. And then they say, I'm going to kill people from this set. I'm going to kill people from this set. And then if you look at kind of like the specific people they named, right? Like they named the orange set. There's like someone from the orange group that they named. They named the purple set. We have someone from like the purple group. And what's interesting is like the blue dots, right? Because like the rapper didn't like shout out the blue set necessarily, but we know that the blue set is associated with like the same nation as the other groups, right? So it seems like these like hierarchies are kind of like playing out as far as like the individuals that kind of get referenced to everything. And so, like, this is kind of my final point. So we believe that the rap stuff could like really be like instrumental in creating conflict. There's like an ongoing debate. Forrest Stewart talks about in his book, and he says that no one has the data to think about this. I think we're getting close here. So this is a song that came out that was like very, very disrespectful. Like it had a title that was very disrespectful. And like even compared to like the other diss tracks, like it was just like really kind of like making light of people that have died. And within a month of the song coming out, that rapper was murdered in broad daylight in like a very, very safe part of Chicago. So we're kind of interested in like the role that kind of like the rap beef could play in putting people at risk. And so the long-term goal for all of this is I would really love to develop a social work tool that can help social workers understand when and where someone is at risk. Right, so to kind of like tell a story and then tell like a little like hypothetical vignette of like someone's ascent into drill rap stardom. Right, so like right now we have like the gang set map, nation map, excuse me, and then we have like a little red circle in the lower corner. Right, I'm imagining like that is like someone's home neighborhood. Right, like anyone who lives in that neighborhood is at like some risk of violence, just like in the event that someone attacks their set. Right, and so I'm imagining you have like a young gang affiliate person. They want to get famous, they release a diss track, right? And then they're not only kind of like unsafe in their own neighborhood, but also the opposing set. And what I imagine, or hypothesize about, I should probably say, is that as someone kind of like becomes more known in like the kind of like rap scene, they will increasingly face more risk, right? All of a sudden, it's not just like the set that you dissed, it's like all the other sets from that nation, right? And eventually, I believe that like someone could be like such a target that like really like all of Chicago becomes unsafe. Like this is like something that actually like has played out sometimes. So I think it would just be like really cool. Like we're not quite there yet, but like some kind of tool that's like monitoring the internet and kind of like sending information to social workers like, hey, this person is in a precarious position. Like maybe you can like step in and do something. Because there is actually literature that like those kind of interventions are successful. And so before I kind of go on the questions, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my team from the Environmental Neuroscience Lab. Naquan, Alfred, and Mark have all been really kind of like instrumental in this project getting done. Other than that, thank you. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Quickly, for the part about people who have passed away, I'm curious what percentage of that network has passed away?
Oh, 33.
And how does that compare to previous work, like the Papa Christmas work?
I don't know the percentage in Pop Crystals, but like gotta be small. Like I think it's like below 10%.
So I'm wondering if like it's not even in this case, of course, the network connections matter, but is it just that like the risk of death increases just because so many people are at risk and have actually passed away?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Would you know like methodologically how to like disentangle those? I'm not sure I actually know the
You
answer.
could look at a random network instead of this network and see like how does they, like if you randomly distribute the ties to people who have died
Got it.
and see.
Yeah, that'd be like a really good robustness check.
The average network where you have homicides, average about 30% of that network is also shot, if not killed. If that helps in Chicago.
So you're saying like what I have is like kind of matches your understanding?
Yeah, the Chicago, like between Boston and Chicago, it averages about 30% of the
Okay.
network.
All right, yeah, so it's like what we got.
It's in your intercept.
Of neighborhood networks or the entire network?
Of networks of people who've already been shot.
Questions?
Is this data being scraped? Is there an API? How is it-
Yeah, so it's like someone else in the crowd is like collecting all this information. It comes from like a larger platform. So someone is like collecting information from like all of the posts on this platform, and we like subset it to just like specific community.
Yeah, 2 questions. Thanks so much for sharing your work. I wanted to ask for the kind of big network representation. Looking at Papa Christo's work, he uses a force-directed graph, and I think that's a lot easier to identify clusters of groups. Have you tried playing with force-directed visualization?
Yeah, so I have my visual expert over here. Naquan, what visual structure do we use for the?
I think this was Force Atlas. So and we initially had all the name labels on the visualization, but so in order to not get it clustered around, then we kind of had to separate the group in like more sparse way. That's the visualization we ended up with because like we didn't have time to update it. We decided that we want to anonymize everything on the data, so that's the reason why it looks more sparse and not clustered.
Yeah, that's definitely something that we should explore more.
Yeah, for legibility and comparison with the other work and make it more one-to-one. The other thing I wanted to ask, and actually on the top of the previous question, is why this forum and not Twitter or YouTube or Reddit? Why is this forum the data source to explore?
I just thought it was like really interesting to explore like what does the crowd know, right? I mean, I think it'd be a lot harder to go on Twitter and like identify like this is a gang member talking about gang stuff. Like this is not. I mean, someone actually came up with like a machine learning algorithm that can like take Twitter profiles text and like tag someone as a gang member or not, which I think is like kind of crazy. So there is a way to pursue this, but I mean, honestly, this is like a forum that like I have kind of like read for a while, like it like piqued my interest like over a year ago. So just like one that I've been using personally to learn about Chicago gang stuff. And I realized like maybe there is like something rigorous here, or maybe there was nothing rigorous here, right? I needed to like toss out that investigation a long time ago. So it was kind of like, I wouldn't call it a convenience sample, but it was like kind of like some casual internet ethnography led me to taking interest in this, let's say.
Sure, thanks.
I have related questions to that. So at the end, we ended up with like 250-ish individuals identified, and I think we started with like 250,000 posts.
Yep.
So how many posts ended up being relevant in those 250 people?
It was like in the ballpark of 6,000.
Do you know how many were relevant to the people that were identified under the threshold that were discarded? So like relevant posts that were still discarded.
Nicole, you know the answer to that question by any chance? I don't know the answer to that one.
Not online or public.
If you want though, I'd be happy to take that and I can like send you an email about it.
Have you gotten the feedback of any gang members or former gang members?
No, we really want to do that. Just thinking about how.
Okay.
But yeah, we'd love to do that.
Could take another question or two.
There's one on the from Emmanuel Hernandez. The Berto Aspel argues that the process of gang structure changed the vertical error from the horizontal mix conviction. Affiliations are familiar in its smaller levels, such as street level. Are there any hints of new patterns of association?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like, so I'm gonna be transparent. Like, I don't fully know the vertical versus horizontal click argument, but we do see like these sets within nations have like a lot of interaction. Like when I started this project, I thought like all of like the kind of distinct sets that I was looking at were actually like different names of the same thing. So it's like really fuzzy. You have like a lot of kind of like cross interaction between the sets that seems to be based around like social histories, like people that like went to school together, it seems like might still hang out even when they're in like opposing gangs type of thing.
I guess my question is similar to his, but did you get feedback from like social workers? How would this data like be different from like data that are already there, like saying where vulnerable areas?
Yeah, no, that's like definitely a conversation that I'd like to have. Is like thinking of how I can like innovate on what's already out there. But I don't know, like a deep kind of like sense of what tools social workers are using. Like my sense, I've like seen that there's like people that are like manually following Twitter to like see like they have like some profiles they follow and like, okay, we're like manually reading it to see if something's going up. To me, it seems like an AI thing could be like much more high powered and like save work for the social workers. Like I'm imagining like social workers wouldn't have to do as much like reading of material on their own to kind of get there. But that's something I probably need to like double check with some social workers.
On that spirit and following several of these questions, so you have all these different potential sources. So you have this forum, Twitter, YouTube, apparently, right? With video is very important, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sort of a huge data fusion problem, right? In which you could imagine bringing these tools to the same thing. Also, have much finer temporal resolution. Do you know if there's any temporal rhythms in this? Crime has very strong temporal rhythms, right? When it happens and so on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know the temporal rhythms. I mean, it seems like you kind of have like this moment of like punctuated equilibrium where like an event happens, right? Like someone big gets shot and then things are like really hot for a little bit. But as far as kind of like what is like the time scale of that, when is like a murder lead to this like punctuated equilibrium, when does it kind of get ignored? Those are kind of questions that I haven't tapped into yet, just because of the data structure.
And that just relates to seasonality as well, right? Like I imagine people are seeing more in the summer. There's also been shootings more often. So
yeah, so I mean, homicides tend to get like reported like at a high rate compared to other crimes. So I'd assume that like all of the homicides are at least being heard about. If you're talking about like a signal issue.
just to circle back to the last question, then the number is 5,600-ish, so about 6,000.
All right, everybody. So Riley's here, is local, so I see that there's a lot of interest. So don't be shy, don't be strangers, and the work is ongoing. So thank you everyone for coming.